Good morning, church. It's Good Friday, and I just want to share a few thoughts with you as we proceed through this Holy Week. I hope that the thoughts yesterday were encouraging as I called us to be a people who recognize that God serves, that God saves, and that God hears our cry. Today, we pivot in our thoughts towards the cross. And Good Friday is a day that we remember the last hours and the last moments in the life of Jesus as he went to the cross for our salvation. This is a very difficult time, a very dark time, and a very dark day for us to remember. I want us to just be aware of two things as we proceed through this day, two tendencies that we might have in regards to Good Friday. The first tendency I want to talk about is our tendency we have as Christians to sometimes shy away from the negative. You may notice as I preach or teach, I'm never prone to do that because I think that it's important for us to sit in the difficult moments, to acknowledge the difficult moments. I think there's an underlying pressure that we feel as Christians to be happy all the time, to silver lining everything, as Brene Brown would say, to act as though everything is just grand and going well in this world. And Good Friday is the opposite of this. It's a very real and visceral representation of a dark and difficult time as Jesus gives his life for the world, as he suffers the humiliation and the shame that's heaped upon him from others, the insults that are hurled at him, and ultimately as he experiences the physical suffering as well of enduring the cross. There's a temptation that we have to fast forward to Sunday, but Good Friday bids us to stay at the foot of the cross, to see Christ there, to be fully aware of what he experienced and the embodied nature of the incarnation and the death of Jesus Christ. That this was not a fairy tale, that this was not a story of a person, but this was God in flesh, a person with hands and feet that were real and that were nailed to the tree. You know, it's interesting because we see this tendency play out in the Protestant world in that we don't even demonstrate the cross and display the cross with Jesus hanging on it. But we want to fast forward to that moment of victory. But today, let's take a few moments to sit in the sorrow of Good Friday and acknowledge it. Acknowledge how real and literal and visceral this was, that Jesus gave his life on the cross for us. The second tendency that I want to address today as we approach Good Friday is that we tend to use this opportunity of talking about the cross as a way to draw people into shame. And maybe you've experienced that in your history with churches or your faith journey, that there are some people who are eager to make us feel shameful and burden us on this day, to almost accept the fault as our own that Jesus went to the cross, to make us question our value because of the sin in our lives. And I want to just caution against that there's a healthy way to do that and an unhealthy way to do that. As I just said, it's healthy to sit in the reality of the cross, to recognize what Jesus experienced and went through and sacrificed for all of creation. However, we can do so without questioning our value, because the great irony in this is that while some use this as an opportunity to shame us, to make us think of how terrible we are, the reality is that the compelling factor that took Jesus to the cross was not that he despised us, but that he loved us. And so I pray that in this moment, as we recognize how dark and difficult this moment was, as we sit in the reality of the pain and suffering of Christ, I pray that in the midst of that, we can still be reminded that the motivating factor behind all of this was the inexplicable and incomprehensible love that God has for each one of us. That is what compelled Christ to the cross, is a desire for us to be saved. And so, in the midst of this darkness, in the midst of this moment that to the disciples must have felt like a defeat, this person that they had been following and had put their trust in and had hoped that this was the Messiah that had been long promised, as they witnessed the cross, this must have felt like a defeat. And as we proceed through our lives, there are moments that we question things and that we feel like we might be defeated. But just know that God is with us. So take a moment today to reflect on what Christ was willing to sacrifice for us, the life that he gave, and the call that he gives to us to take up our cross and to follow him. May God be praised because of what Christ was willing to do for us. May God be praised because of his great love for us as demonstrated in the life and the death of Christ Jesus.